MC for this session. The session is called Strengthening Climate and Disaster Resilience Through Social Protection. Before we dive into this session, I'd just like to make 3 important announcements, housekeeping announcements. First, after the closing session at lunchtime, we will continue to have group discussions to prepare concrete action plans as follow-up to this week. The group discussions will happen from 2 to 4 p.m. Participants are encouraged to sign up to one of the following sessions. There are 6 all in all using the app. All of you know about the app, right? So there's one session on facilitating data collection, on monitoring social protection. Second is fast-tracking HIV-sensitive social protection. Third is financing social protection for achieving SDGs, experience from 6 countries, including Azerbaijan, Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, Timor-Leste, and Uzbekistan. The fourth is roundtable on developing evidence-based on aging and long-term care, social protection interagency cooperation board, digital social protection working group meeting, and the last is the Transform program. So please sign up to one of these 6 sessions for follow-up group discussions for concrete actions. Okay, second is we invite all participants to fill out the evaluation form. So please do take time to fill up the application form so that we will have information to make this a better, for us to organize a better session, event for you next year. Okay, please sign up, please fill up the evaluation form. And the third important announcement is for all participants, there's free airport transfer. So if you're flying out today or tomorrow, please ask the organizer help desk at the registration area for any question. Okay, and now to begin our session on climate change and disaster risk resilience. May we call on Rachel Slater, who is your moderator for this session. She is the Adaptive Social Protection Specialist at the International Institute for Environment and Development. Ms. Rachel.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us at this session, where we're going to talk about how we might strengthen climate and disaster resilience using social protection. I'm really pleased to welcome our speakers, who I hope will help us explore opportunities that we have to use social protection programs more effectively in support of climate and disaster resilience, and also help us consider some of those challenges that we'll face in trying to do so. Now, I think it's useful for those of you for whom this is a new topic to just briefly map out some of the terrain. The first thing that I'd say is that frequently when we talk about social protection and resilience or climate change, we can talk across all stages of a disaster management cycle, but quite often we don't. We often only talk about some of them. So social protection can help mitigate, it can help prevent disasters impacting on people. So for example, when we have a public works program that prevents soil erosion, so we plant trees or we establish better irrigation systems or flows of water, and they help us stop landslides or floods. We don't often pay much attention to that part of it. We can also use social protection to support disaster preparedness. So one thing that happens in a number of countries is that all the people whose phone numbers we have, because they're part of a social protection program, we can message them. So after the Nepal earthquakes, beneficiaries of the Social Security allowances programs were texted and told, be careful, there probably will be aftershocks. So we can also use our social protection machinery to help us get people more prepared for a shock. We also can use social protection in disaster responses. So when a crisis has hit, we can use it to support people. And we do that in two main ways. One is that we can scale our program vertically, so our existing beneficiaries get a greater amount of support in a particular month or over a period of months. We might top up what they get by $30 a month to help them. Or, if we have the right things in place, we can scale horizontally. So we can bring new beneficiaries into the system very quickly and provide them with temporary support while they're facing the challenges of a disaster. And sometimes we can even take other people that we know very little about and use our cash delivery mechanisms, like mobile banking, to get support to people very quickly. That's the bit that we know quite a lot about. The other bits we know relatively little about. And then finally, we can also use social protection for disaster recovery. So again, things like public works programs we can use to reconstruct local public assets. But we can also use cash transfers to support recovery in another way. We know that people who get cash transfers regularly and reliably are better able to access credit. So if somebody wants to rebuild their house and needs some capital to do so, they're more likely to be able to get it if they're poor because they're in a social protection program. People who make loans are more willing to loan to people who receive cash transfers, and they also loan at better rates. So there are lots of opportunities, and in the last few years we've actually made substantial progress, particularly on the response part of this. There are good things about the progress that we've made, and there are also challenges. So I want to just show you three quick analogies that we've used. In Mexico, there's somebody who works in the World Bank on social protection and disaster response, and he has these great two slides where he puts up a photograph of two cars. They're actually the same car. One of them is really clean and is being used every day. So we know that when we get in that car and turn the ignition, it will start and it will take us to where we want to go. The other car is dirty. We don't know if the battery's flat or not. We won't know until we get in it and try. And his analogy says, which car do you want to go in when there's a disaster? If we're going to try and do a disaster response, do we want to use the car we drive in every day? Because that's the social protection car. We deliver social protection every day. Shouldn't we use that car for our disaster response? Or do we want to get in the car that we only use once a year? Or once every 5 years? Or perhaps in the case of a really serious earthquake, once every 50 years? So that's one analogy about how we can lean on the systems that we already have. The other one is just a reflection on things that I've seen before in Nepal, but I also saw over the last couple of days here in Rosario and Muntinlupa. So we were asking people at community level over the last couple of days, and we were asking district councillors, if somebody's in the Pantawid program, do they go to the top of the list when there's a disaster? And we got all sorts of different answers to that question. So some people said to us, no, they don't get any disaster support at all because they already have something. They've already got something to fall back on. And other people said, yes, they're the most vulnerable. So when there's a disaster, they need something else as well as Pantawid. And we had these debates happening at the local level about whether people who are in social protection programs are so vulnerable that they need extra support, or whether they're actually already getting something, and so we shouldn't help them. So some real difficult things for us to deal with when we're trying to do this. I guess in terms of those challenges, I'd like us to pick up on three things today. So first of all, are some social protection approaches more appropriate for us to support resilience through them than others? So for example, programs that are targeted based on age or social categories versus programs that target based on poverty. Do some of them offer better opportunities than others? Second, what sorts of systems and architecture are needed? Do we have lists of the poor? Do we have lists of near poor? Are they connected to our social protection payment systems and so on? And then finally, institutionally, how do we manage all of this? What sorts of governance systems and policy frameworks and implementation frameworks will help us get this right? Now, to start us off in exploring some of these issues, I'm really pleased to welcome our three speakers. So first, we have Marianne Maria Daroy, She's the Director of Social Development Staff at the National Economic and Development Authority, NEDA, here in the Philippines. So she's a public servant with 42 years of service, straddling from her being a project officer in the Human Development Regulatory Commission. She served as a Senior Economic Development Specialist to the Assistant Director of National Economic Development Authority Regional Office. And she's worked in Region 2 in particular, where she was the Acting Chairman of Regional Development Council. She assumed the role as Director 4 of the Social Development Staff of NEDA Central Office from August 2017 up to the present. So let's welcome Maria. And we're really hoping that she's going to help us in particular think about policy frameworks and institutional arrangements for linking disaster management with social protection. Our next speaker is Hang Thi Tan Pham, who's a Senior Resilience Officer for the FAO Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Before joining FAO, she's been a Regional Program Officer for the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction in the Asia Pacific, and has been a sub-regional coordinator for ASEAN, leading the engagement between local governments and parliaments for national disaster resilience. She's also coordinated basin development planning for the Mekong River Commission, and for 10 years, she was a focal point for crisis prevention and recovery in UNDP Vietnam. If we welcome her. Thank you. And we really hope Hang will help us to think about the roles that international agencies, multilateral agencies such as FAO might play, and those linkages with crisis prevention. And then finally, I'd like to welcome Joanna Pickles, who's the First Secretary for Poverty and Social Development at the Australian Embassy in Jakarta. She oversees Australia's work on poverty and social protection, including social protection policy forum in Indonesia, so centered around the Mahkota program, which is an $80 million bilateral investment. She also works to support the World Bank's office in Jakarta and their work on social protection. Before starting in Jakarta, she worked at DFAT's headquarters in Canberra, and she managed a number of research activities on shock-responsive social protection and cash transfers in the Pacific. So we look forward to hearing from Jo. Let's welcome her. About how social protection might contribute across different elements of disaster risk management, and what she thinks the implications are for policy, for coordination between actors, and for financing. So I'm going to hand over first to Maria. There is a lovely clock to make you feel pressurized and panicked about your presentation, but I'd say we're already prepared, so let's hear what you have to say to our audience. Thank you.
I hope I can, so right? Yes. Okay. Distinguished social protection champions of Asia Pacific, the dynamic and progressive development partners of ADB, friends and colleagues, good morning. Today I am tasked to present to you the Philippines' social protection initiatives to ensure a strengthened climate and disaster resilient Filipinos. The 30-second video highlights the Philippines' exposure to these natural disasters. The Philippines is the third in the World Risk Index ranking, where 1 out of 5 Filipinos belonging to the poor is mostly affected by natural and human-induced disasters. Thus, there is a need to have coordinated systems to better respond and adapt to these shocks. Adapting to climate risks and shocks is primary to the vulnerability response of government, guided by its adopted definition that states social protection constitutes policies and programs that seek to reduce poverty and vulnerability to risks and enhance the social status and rights of the marginalized by promoting and protecting livelihood and employment, protecting against hazards and sudden loss of income, and improving people's capacity to manage risks. Operationalizing the country's adopted social protection was enacted through the adoption of revised social protection operational framework, which also accounts for climate change and risk reduction and management. The revised SPOF uses a risk management approach as a key component in identifying risks and vulnerabilities, supported by principles of universality, inclusivity, and of having a transformative role. Here is the Philippine Development Plan Chapter 11 Strategic Framework, which features our strategies that addresses the individual, economic, and natural, and human-induced, and governance and political risks. The strategies under the natural hazards and human-induced risks include rollout of climate vulnerability assessment and climate disaster risk assessment nationwide, develop facilities for adaptive, including risk transfer mechanisms, provide adequate transition houses and livelihood opportunities for disaster victims during early rehabilitation and recovery period, and provide adequate mental health and psychosocial support. In the 2018 Socioeconomic Report, the following policy measures and guidelines for mitigating the impact of disasters have been developed. A climate risk management framework was developed to guide climate actions for ensuring human safety and preventing economic losses. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, or PhilVox, produced hazard maps to aid in local development and contingency planning and be used as a reference in creating designs of buildings and infrastructure. It includes active fault maps, tsunami hazard maps, liquefaction hazard maps, earthquake-induced landslide hazard maps, and ground shaking hazard maps. As of November 2018, the Rapid Earthquake Damage Assessment System training and software were provided to 73 provinces, 611 cities and municipalities, including 17 government institutions, 32 state universities and colleges, 73 private companies, and 10 non-government organizations. And lastly, local government units were provided access to quick disbursing payouts, such as the parametric or catastrophic risk insurance program, which allowed for the quick response to the needs of LGUs affected by natural calamities. Other SP or social protection initiatives include the Republic Act 10639, or an act mandating the telecommunications service providers to send free mobile alerts in the event of natural and man-made disasters and calamities to inform people of the impending disasters to prevent injuries, destruction, and loss of lives and property. The Batingao mobile app that was introduced in 2017, which is handy mobile guide that educates users on disaster preparedness and gives them tools that can be used in emergency situations. The Unified Cash Transfer Program that provided emergency relief to 10,000 vulnerable families in Tacloban City and neighboring areas during Typhoon Yolanda, and the weather index-based crop insurance that is being piloted to allow farmers to make insurance claims automatically when certain weather conditions are expected to affect the livelihood of the farmers. Also, on February 28, NEDA and the Housing and Urban Development Coordinating Council signed an agreement creating multi-agency groups to address the concerns of urban poor communities in the country. The group was formed after the Asian Development Bank selected the Philippines as one of the 3 developing member countries to receive research and knowledge support under a regional technical assistance project entitled Advancing Inclusive and Resilient Urban Development Targeted at the Urban Poor. The RETA aims to enhance capacities of governments to design and implement investment projects that strengthen the resilience of urban poor, and financing of the project will come from the Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund under the Urban Financing Partnership Facility being administered by the ADB. And because the Philippines is a nature-defined recipient of this or destination of natural occurrences, it is therefore imperative to make all Filipinos resilient and strong. It has become hotter and at times colder. Typhoons, cyclones have become more frequent, and lately even earthquakes and volcano eruptions. Ice caps have melted and continue to do so, and sea levels have risen while population continues to increase as well. This is the global phenomena. Thus, we need to purposely work on strengthening our social protection programs and initiatives so that by 2040, we indeed will achieve the Philippines' ambition of having a matatag, maginhawa at panatag na buhay for all. Thank you and good morning.
Sorry, Rachel, how do I open? Okay. Very good morning. I thank the organizers for the opportunity to share the experience from the joint UN work in promoting the social protections as an instrument for strengthening disaster and climate resilience in ASEAN, as well as some of the FAO work. So in ASEAN, with the support from the European Civil Protections and humanitarian aid, and in partnerships with the ADB, we have been looking at the opportunities to make social protection shock responsive or adaptive, as in other words, developing the ASEAN guideline for disaster risk responsive social protections, as well as country roadmaps in countries like Cambodia, Myanmar, Philippines, and Vietnam. And now the implementation of these country roadmaps and ASEAN guideline is starting. Will also focus on early warning, early actions, or forecast-based financing. So I have 6 reflections and messages. The first one is really there is a momentum to look at social protections as an instrument for disaster and climate resilience, but we need more institutional approach and resilient focus. And in ASEAN, there is a lot of political interest and buy-in with this agenda. And that is due to a number of factors. One is that the increasing investment by the government in social protections, as we have been talking over this week. Second is that the countries in the regions like highly vulnerable to disasters and climate change like ASEAN, countries have seen the increasing losses of disasters and the costly reactive response to those events. And that triggered the countries in looking for innovative solutions to deal with these problems. The third one is the whole shift towards more proactive risk management from the reactive response, as reflected in the new generation of disaster risk management legislation and policies over the last decade in the countries. And also in the ASEAN, we have a very unique enabling regional framework where social safety net, social protection is recognized as crucial in both the ASEAN Agreement for Disaster Management and Response and the regional framework for strengthening social protection for poverty reductions. But our 2 years of work with advocacy, supporting the countries with analysis of opportunities and coming up with what are the actions to make this a reality, still point to the very strong needs of more awareness raising. is not only the disaster risk management agencies and social protections, but also agencies like planning and finance. And that's why I'm so pleased to see Director Marian from NEDA here, because this is very crucial as we learn from the countries to have agencies like yours in advocating for the agenda. And also these whole issues of institutional coordinations to make sure that there is clarity of roles and responsibilities, information system to support this integrated approach. Now, second, which is very much the continuity from the institutional approach, is the need for multi-stakeholder approach and policy coherence. So these figures on the screen is coming from the latest Asia-Pacific Disaster Report in 2019 from the EXCAP. EXCAP has modeled the progress of poverty reductions that show that the extreme poverty is going to fall in all countries in the regions. But in some countries, this progress is going to reduce by half if disasters are not mitigated, like in Pakistan, in Laos, in Cambodia, or Timor-Leste. And the same report is also modeled and convey the message that disaster is going to widen inequalities and argue for the need for all the sectors, including social protections, to deal with these disasters and climate risks, to break the vicious circle of poverty, disasters, and inequality. And then the whole issue is to argue for making the development risk-informed and resilience, as well as supporting people to be more resilient to disasters. So in our work, what has come out is that, yes, the recognition is in the single sector policy, but policy needs to speak to each other. So social protection policies, we need to also look at the role in food security and nutrition and building resilience as part of poverty reductions and reducing vulnerability. The disaster risk management policy, as I said, is moving towards more risk management and resilience building, but that needs to include social protection as a measure in its kind of national agenda and program. Climate change adaptation policies, we need to focus more on vulnerability reductions and resilience building, and therefore linking with disaster risk reductions in its policies and financing. Now, the third message is about integrated information systems. Perhaps I don't need to talk about it more after you heard about Director Marian from NEDA talking about the accomplishments in terms of climate risk information, the hazard mapping, the impact assessment. So integrating disaster risks and vulnerability information into the social protections information system is still crucial to enabling identifications of vulnerable populations, for targeting, for impact-based forecasting, for identifying the indicators and thresholds that will trigger the early actions gearing towards the needs of the vulnerable populations. But as FAO, I also emphasize the point that our work, for example, in Fiji or Laos, integrating the early warning system in the regular agromat services and climate services to support the day-to-day crop management and agriculture productions also show the effectiveness of seeing this early warning system, not only for emergency response, but also for the regular resilient agriculture development and livelihood. The fourth point is really integrated intervention build resilience. So on the screen, you see the feedback from the two beneficiaries of FAO work in Indonesia in response to the earthquake in Sulawesi. So the examples are clearly showing that our Cash Plus agriculture and fisheries input enable the beneficiaries to take risk and engage in resilient livelihood, in recovery, and transitioning them from productive and sustainable towards productive and sustainable livelihood, and therefore become more resilient to future shocks. The other diagram is showing the example in Cambodia, where we didn't work through social protection, but the example actually gave idea to see what can be done with social protections, where we actually use cash for work, what we call is Cash Plus. Cash for work, but also inputs, technology transfer, and capacity building for the communities to engage in watershed management, where they can actually build the in-stream infrastructure, recover the destroyed forests, recover the riparian vegetations, and that is also facilitate the community solidarity and resilience, where several communities decided that they only take 7 out of the 10 days cash for work and then put back the money for community development. That actually, this point remind me of the very inspiring sections on the graduation approach that we had yesterday. And this is very similar to graduation approach, but in the context of disaster and climate resilience building using social protections. Fifth is the need for innovative financing. So we've heard a lot this week about how to finance the expansion of social protection. We also need innovative mechanisms to finance the shock responsive social protections and early actions. So the early action funds by FAO or the forecast-based action fund by the IFRC and other kind of piloting mechanisms are very important mechanisms to really see how we transform the humanitarian aid, but also to bring in development aid to support this preparedness and resilience building. And others, like the Emerging Disaster Fund in different countries with the new legislations, is going to be, as well as disaster risk financing and climate financing. Last but not least, it's a quick point on how FAO adds value to all of this agenda. So we're doing it in two aspects. One is about strengthening the systems, where we bring in our experience in early warning system, food security information analysis, to strengthen this kind of information in the social protection system, where we integrate the livelihood aspect from the fisheries, crop, forest independent community, as well as herders, into the design of social protections, as well as reflecting the conflict sensitivity analysis in the programming. The second aspect is resilience building, where the example that I have mentioned really reflect how our work can actually contribute to this integrated approach of social protection for climate and disaster resilience. Thank you.
Thanks, Hang and Marianne and Rachel. Great start to the panel session. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank the ADB for bringing us all together for what's been a really excellent week of discussion and learning, very dynamic and rich. So as we've sort of discussed already, social protection, climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction share a common approach to managing risk, but there are a lot of differences. To begin with, the kinds of risks they manage are completely different. There are different spatial scales when we talk from the micro household level to the regional, to the national, all the way up to the global level. Practically, they often work in different time scales, the immediate disaster response versus the very long-term climate change adaptation planning. And importantly, they often reside in different arms of government. So there's a lot of barriers to bringing these three sectors together, but I think the good news is we're beginning to see convergence. And I think one kind of practical way to talk about this is talking through the disaster preparedness, response and recovery cycle, and how social protection delivery systems, sometimes informed by climate risk tools, are supporting that process. In the preparedness stage, there's quite a lot of activity happening across the globe and in this region around social and beneficiary registries and how these can be leveraged to support disaster preparedness and response. Particular examples that we've heard cited are around the Benazir Income Support Program in Pakistan, where the proxy means test uses climate, sort of agroclimate indicators in terms of household ranking. Similarly, not in this region, but in the Dominican Republic, the social registry calculates the probability that a household might be affected by climate shocks. Registries can also make themselves more useful in times of disaster by collecting more disaster-ready information. Things like geolocating households so you know where they are, or as Rachel already mentioned, having phone numbers included so that you can contact people in times of disaster. Bank accounts, although that's often a step further. Another simple thing that, well, not simple, but another thing that countries are doing is building bigger registries. If you've got more of your population on the registry, it's more usable in times of disasters. an example like Tonga, I was speaking with Louisa yesterday, and they're building their registry at the moment with exactly this kind of idea in mind. Make it broader, so while you've got your regular community that you're reaching out to, you can also use that information for disaster response. Also at the preparedness level, there's a lot of work that is happening to a varied extent around cross-sectoral contingency planning. How do you think through how disaster contingency financing can be linked to social assistance? What are the appropriate triggers? Who's responsible, and what are those roles and responsibilities from the national down to the subnational level? And I think it's important for development partners and donors to think about how we might work within these systems and help governments to scale up in times of disaster, but also how we might use elements of their system within the responses that we fund. Also, slightly further along the preparedness continuum, some countries are already beginning to link their their social assistance responses to early warning systems, and Hung talked about that in this region. There are certainly, it's proven in other parts of the world. You can see in Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, the slow onset droughts and the way that HSMP and PSMP respond to those. But I think there are innovative ideas from this region about faster onset disasters, about the potential of forecast-based financing linked to early warning systems, particularly for floods. Goes without saying, there's a lot of activity also happening in the response phase. We've seen in this region, Fiji able to get support very quickly out to recipients of their social assistance programs within 1 month of Tropical Cyclone Winston striking Fiji. Likewise, Tonga did it even faster. Within 3 weeks, they were able to provide additional assistance to the elderly and the disabled on their social assistance programs with Australian support, and we're very proud to be able to do that. We've also heard the Philippines and the great work that's gone on here, really leading the charge globally following Yolanda or Haiyan, and continuing to build along with their systems. And likewise, Nepal and UNICEF. So there's a lot of examples from this region. In the recovery phase, we've also talked about public works and the potential and the usability in terms of responding to recovery needs and providing income and employment following a disaster. So these are all great ideas, and there's stuff happening, but I think it's important. Sorry. All right, I'll go back one. The very fact of having regular and predictable social protection programs in place builds household and individual resilience to shocks. And Rachel's written widely about the 3 A's framework, the ability to absorb, anticipate, and adapt. And I find that a really useful framing tool. So anticipatory capacity talks about having regular cash transfers and how they help people invest in more productive livelihoods or save in anticipation of a shock. You can see here Mary from Fiji, she used a top-up payment by the government, and she used that money to buy 5 goats, which she was breeding and which would then provide her with additional income, and so she had more resilient sort of economic setup to weather any future shocks. There's also the ability of these programs to build absorptive capacity. So cash transfers allow people to meet their basic consumption needs during a shock, and most importantly, reduce their losses after a shock. There are a lot of global examples around this. In Kenya again, drought consumption remaining stable for recipients of HSMP. In Mexico, reductions in families relying on child labour because they were receiving regular cash transfers following a drought. And in Fiji, Narayan Das was able to rebuild his house after Tropical Cyclone Winston devastated it. Okay, and the final point is around building adaptive capacity. This is about the long-term ability of households to respond. There's a lot of literature, there's a lot of thinking in this space, but there's less practice. The idea is cash plus, a bit like what Hang talked about. These often complementary programs that help households improve their livelihoods and become less vulnerable to climate risk. I think this is a really interesting space. It will be important to learn from different programs as they're piloted, but I think we also need to be aware of asking too much of these systems too early, and just by getting the basics right, getting regular, predictable, adequate benefits, that alone helps poor households potentially meet the increased costs of climate change. So my final slide. So there are lots of opportunities here, but to move forward, we need policy leadership. This is not the sort of thing that's going to happen organically. It needs to be financed. Coordination is probably one of the hardest tasks, and it's critical in this space. And when all of these basic elements are in place, integrating big systems with new capabilities requires technical solutions. We can see this space is important, really important for this region, but it's still a frontier. And where there are pilots, we need to evaluate them, we need to learn from them. And this is something DFAT sort of feels quite motivated about. We've funded the World Bank to do a bunch of studies in the Pacific and also in Indonesia. But I think also opportunities like this where we can come together and talk about those practical experiences are really valuable. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for some really inspiring talks that have given, I don't know about you, but me lots of ideas about things that we might take forward. I'm expecting somebody to turn up with a tablet for me in a moment with some questions on it. But perhaps I could just open the floor and see if there are any questions immediately coming from the floor. What I'd like to do, given that we failed in having a mixed gender panel today because one of our collaborators from the Prime Minister's office in Pakistan was not able to make it, I'd like to offer the opportunity to a man if they'd like to ask a first question so that we ensure that we get some other voices in the room immediately. Any questions from the floor? Come on, we're an all-woman panel, but we won't eat you. There's one down here at the front. If we could, shall I just pass you this microphone?
Good morning, ma'am. Thank you for strengthening our good foundation for this learning. I am Mike Aguinaldo, a student of international studies here in Manila. And I just wanna ask for you, Director Daruay, if there is one thing that Filipinos would be proud of is our positive and remain hopeful despite or amidst adversities. And Filipinos became resilient, and resiliency became bad at some intense, like people don't get their officials and institutions accountable for solving issues or problems, giving them incompetent with solving issues. How do you say, or what's your comment about this trait, or what is the government intervention to at least help people? Thank you, ma'am.
A lot, actually. I only said a few. But remember that in the Philippines, we have the hierarchy, or rather the NDRRMC. That's the organization that takes charge of what Joanne has mentioned about convergence for preparedness, response, and recovery. So in the NDRRMC, it's National Disaster Resilience and Management Committee or Council, no? And it has different offices under the Office of Civil Defense, who is the chair for that council. And we have provincial and municipal councils also that replicate the activities that are, or rather the mandate of this council for disaster preparedness, recovery, and response even. And this is interagency. So, and also involve the local government units, no? And because of this, we have actually decreased our the deaths and the destructions in property because of early information given to them, aside from the help that was given in terms of distributing the hazard maps. So the local governments are now more aware of when and can actually measure when it will be the disaster can happen in their areas, no, with the disaster maps. And in terms of course, you know the 4 Ps, no, the cash transfers, and then the crop insurance for farmers, as I mentioned earlier, and more social protection programs already implemented by government through the DSWD. And then the latest of which, to guide us all, is the operational framework, no, that was for social protection that was already approved and adopted by the Department of Social Welfare, and of course all the other participating agencies.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Looking at the questions that are coming in through the system now, at the moment I'm going to organise them into 4 sets. So a set of questions about instruments and which instruments work best and when. A set of questions about whether we have any good examples about multi-stakeholder coordination and processes. Some questions about targeting. And then some questions about the point that was raised at the end by Joe about this potential for overburdening and should we always be doing this. So let's start with the questions about instruments. We've got people asking, questions about cash, questions about public works. And I think what we tend to see is that all of our examples of supporting disaster mitigation and supporting disaster recovery tend to be public works examples. And all of our examples about disaster response tend to be cash transfers examples. So I'm going to ask the panel to reflect on that and ask them whether they can come up with other ways of thinking about it, or should we be sticking to that distinction? Can I start with you, Joe? Would that be all right? Do you think that I'm right, that we tend to say mitigation and recovery equals public works and response equals cash transfers? Is that how we're going about it?
Yeah, I think that is largely what's happening. And I guess this is still a pretty new space. So in many cases, these tools are being used for the first time, sometimes the only time. And so I think within that context, you're always going to use the shiny car, perhaps the one that you're used to using, rather than sort of doing something new and different. So I guess that would be an off-the-cuff response. Whether one's better than the other, I don't know. I think it depends on the context.
Any other responses from the panel on that question?
I think there is also a different way to look at that. So I give an example of the intervention that FAO is starting in Paraguay, where we built on the very big government national assistance program, top up the cash assistance, but with the conditions that cash assistance is going to be used for agroforestry or afforestation. So it's not always just mitigation, it's also looking at sustainable resource management, building resilience through the ecosystem approaches.
What we have done so far is integrate. I think we started with integrating climate change and disaster resiliency or reduction in the development plan. I think it is very important that we already know that we are vulnerable in that aspect. So in inclusion in the overall blueprint for development of the country, it is already a chapter in our development plan, which I mentioned earlier, Chapter 11, which talks about the vulnerability of individuals and families of the country. And here, we include the natural hazards and human-induced risks as identified. And I mentioned earlier, these strategies that and programs and projects that have been spelled out already and committed by the different agencies who are part of the disaster risk and climate change agenda for the country. So that's very important for us to be to include it in the overall development blueprint of a country.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to ask if anybody from the floor would like to follow up on any of those questions about which kind of social protection instrument at which moments in a disaster management cycle. Have we got any other comments on that? No. Okay. All right. I'm going to move on to, we have a whole series of questions that have come up about targeting. So we have questions that highlight the risks of the elderly or people with disabilities being left out of disaster response, and what can we do about that? At the same time, we've got questions about how, if your social protection programs are not specifically targeting based on poverty and vulnerability to disasters, how do we ensure that those people get into a social protection system? So I wonder if we could reflect, particularly based on country experiences, of how those different targeting approaches have an implication for the possibilities that we have for using social protection in our climate resilience and disaster resilience responses.
Currently in the Philippines, we have what we call listahanan. Listahanan is actually the list of the poor in the country. No? And we have also included, because it has been expanded lately, we have included also the near poor. And when it comes to disaster response, we make them priorities if their areas are covered. But just the same, even if they are not poor, because of disaster-related phenomenons or occurrences in their areas, everybody is considered. And to address the targeting system, the Philippines now has a Philippine ID system program, which we are piloting and hopefully will already count everybody in. At this point in time, the listahanan is only for particular households, but with the Philippine ID system, we hope that because we already have the universal healthcare system, and then we have free education for everyone, the different programs in the different sectors, then we want everybody to be counted, especially the vulnerable. The vulnerable being the indigenous people, the people with the disabilities, and our senior citizens. So hopefully this system will help us already come up with a more comprehensive listing.
Thank you. And Maria, sorry to follow up, am I correct that initially the use of Listahanan was focused very much on the 4Ps program on Pantawid? Now that's a conditional cash transfer focused on households with children. It's also poverty targeted. So initially there's a risk that Listahanan only helps us scale up following a disaster to households that have children in them. And of course, there are lots of other households that may not be on that list. But increasingly, you're trying to use it, right, to include other households beyond the Pantawid program. Is that right?
And all the other vulnerable groups as well. We also have the expanded CCT already because of the expansion also. And I think it has not yet been rolled out, but we have a Listahanan 3, which is more comprehensive this time. We already have the first Listahanan, which was directed basically on poverty or income-based poverty calculations. And then the second already expanded it to include certain vulnerable people or sectors. And then the Listahanan 3 hopefully will be more comprehensive this time. But it has not yet been rolled out.
Thank you. Joe, would you like to come in here?
Yeah, thanks. Just on the question of elderly and people with disabilities, I think actually, often they cannot be covered by disaster response, but depending on the country and depending on the setup, actually social protection can work to cover those particular people in times of disaster. And I think, again, just reflecting on Tonga's example, while they're relatively, since 2012, been building their social protection systems, it's relatively new. They invested in disabled and elderly first off, and so then when Cyclone Gita struck Tonga, those particularly vulnerable households were able to be reached within 3 weeks. So I think it's actually can be, depending on the context, a really great mechanism for those vulnerable populations. On the second question of the poverty targeting focus, I think for me this is one tool in the toolkit of disaster response. You certainly can't be expecting it to solve all of the problems. While coverage is a massive issue, these are still programs that are growing from a small base and growing quickly in this region. If the system is set up in a way that it can move quickly, what shock responsive social protection offers is timeliness. And I think all of the research shows that if you're trading off coverage and timeliness, actually getting assistance to people quickly can make a huge difference to them. So that's one thing in its favour, but it needs to be seen as one tool or one piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And so I think that's why issues of coordination are critical, and ensuring that the social protection response is part of a broader response to sort of make sure that everyone is covered in as much as they can be. I guess finally, I think one of the critical issues is around the ability of the system to narrowcast geographically, and some systems can't do that yet. But where they can, it can be a good tool.
There's a great example about what you do about things like disability during a disaster response from Nepal. So in Nepal, there are allowances for people with disabilities, but there's 4 categories of disability, and only people in the 2 most severe categories get the 400 rupees a month. The people in the other 2 categories don't get anything. And one of the things that is being explored at the moment is whether during a disaster you scale your disability allowances so that the other 2 categories get included temporarily. So I think there are opportunities not necessarily to try and put people with disabilities into your core relief response, but to think about how you can adapt your programming for people with disabilities at the time. I'm just wondering whether you want to follow up on any of this?
We just wanted to share the way that we put information on disaster and climate vulnerability as... Just wanted to share the experience that we, for example, work in Mindanao in the Philippines to kind of like prepare the disaster and climate vulnerability data informations to input into targeting through social protections. So important elements that we look at as a past. So the focus is drought. The important elements to look at as the past events of the similar scale, where and who and what were affected and how, because the drought affected different population group differently. So among those vulnerable populations, what kind of livelihood patterns? Are they crop dependent? Are they livestock dependent? Are they mixed kind of livelihood strategies? And then it's really important is that what kind of early action is going to meet the need of those vulnerable populations. And that information help with triggering the early fund by FAO, but also the learning can be used in the social protections scheme that can support early actions.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to open the floor to any other questions, particularly about targeting. I think there's a question down here. Your question's about targeting and what we've just been talking about, right? Or is it?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
I just want to mention something about the importance of having a very important instrument in managing disaster response. Just in reference to what Joanne Picoso was saying with elderly and disabilities in Tonga. I just want to share this because it's important to me how the government is managing disaster aftermath after a cyclone hit the country. In terms of, we are targeting the elderly and also the disabled persons, household to be assist in terms of their house was being destroyed. But at the same time, remember the focus is on the person with disability and the elderly household. And that means that only their house that we approach, not the house of person that were not, they don't have a disabled person or elderly person. So in that case, the government come in terms of the NEMO, the shoulder cluster. But the point I want to make here, the importance of coordination amongst government ministries and also development partners to make sure that there is a dialogue in between to ensure that we have also people that are affected but not in our registry to also intervene. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's one of those situations where we need to not look at these different things as alternatives to one another, but think about the ways in which they can complement each other. Did we have another question around targeting? Can I ask you to hold it for us for a second, and I'll come back to you to fit it in? Nothing else on targeting. Okay, I'm going to pick up the next issue that's come up in the questions. And we have been challenged to put our money where our mouths are, okay? So we've all talked a lot about the importance of coordination. We've talked about convergence. I've been hearing all about convergence in the Philippines. And we've been asked to give an example of a multi-stakeholder process that has actually worked and been successful. So perhaps I can ask for any examples that we can provide from the panel.
I was going to stress earlier that because the Philippines knows that it is very vulnerable to climate change and disaster risks already, that's why I mentioned the NDRRMC, because it has helped. Basically, it's an interagency council that brings into fore all the government agencies involved in preparedness and involving even the local government units. I was going to emphasize that preparedness is more important to us now because response has been very effective already, and most of the local government units have already established their rescue teams. And when disaster does occur, no matter if it is man-made or natural, the local governments already are the first responders. So up to the municipal level, the city and municipal level. So given this, the interagency committee in charge of looking into all the risks, natural or man-made, is through the NDRRMC, which already brings together all the agencies for the disaster response and even recovery, where we are very much involved as NEDA.
Thank you.
If I may pick on precisely the process that we had under the Joy UN work in the Philippines, where we actually draw on the National Disaster Risk Reductions and Management Council for bringing this agenda of shock responsive social protection. So within the NDRRMC, the Department of Social Welfare and Development is already leading response, and NEDA is leading recovery. So the process evolving through the council has actually enabled these adoptions of the roadmap by the Department of Social Welfare as part of the operational framework. So in Cambodia, we also had the similar kind of multi-stakeholder approaches involving the new National Council on Protections, as well as the Council for Agriculture and rural development and other concerned ministries that has led to this understanding of the importance of the subject, but also very careful considerations of how that we are going to bring these shock responsive elements into the different existing social protection programs.
Thanks. I guess my own personal experience is these systems are multi-stakeholder just by their very nature. You've got ministries of finance, delivery ministries, you then have payment systems. So, even at that level, it's a kind of multi-stakeholder approach. But I guess just reflecting on Australia's experience working with the government or the Kingdom of Tonga, I think that it shows that even sometimes without necessarily having already had a dialogue or having a plan with government to do it, sometimes you can still work quickly. So Tonga was able to get their payments out within, as I said before, just over 3 weeks of Cyclone Gita striking, and that is within the context of a number of ministries with support from advice from the World Bank and with financial support from Australia. So I think just to say it is possible, and just work together and good lines of communication.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on multi-stakeholder engagements from the floor? Or other questions about coordination? Are we on to your topic now? Brilliant.
It sort of builds out. I'm Karishma from the Makota program in Indonesia. It is sort of building on this coordination aspect, but pushing it a little bit further to actual delivery systems. So I'm intrigued by the FAO example of responding after the earthquake in Sulawesi, and providing this additional cash support to CCT beneficiaries. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the actual delivery mechanism that you used. How did you actually get the cash to these people? Was it just a top-up, to the CCT program? Was it through a different delivery mechanism? But I'm more interested from the panel generally, your experience with actually getting the cash to these households and how you do it.
Okay, I mean, that links into another question that we've got here, which is about the specific measures that you take for distributional and targeting issues post-disaster. So if you'd like to pick up on any of those as well, that would be great. Shall we start with you, Hang, because this specific question was directed to you.
Okay, in the case of Indonesia, we actually piggyback on the system. So we use the same beneficiaries list, but because that we were targeting only these 3 districts in the province after the earthquake, and also using the same kind of like bank account system to transfer. So for agriculture inputs, we work through the provincial and district agriculture office, but the same families that we are targeting to make sure that they have both cash and inputs package to recover the livelihood. Yeah.
Any other responses, or shall I move on? No? I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on to something that I guess takes us into a slightly stickier, more difficult area. Joe introduced this question of overburdening social protection systems, and I have to admit that sometimes when I hear humanitarian agencies talk about piggybacking on social protection, in lots of the countries I work in Africa, I'm kind of saying, well, what social protection are you piggybacking on? That there's not enough there for you to do much. And I think one of the things that we have a tendency to do in social protection is heap it up with huge numbers of objectives. So social protection reduces poverty, social protection tackles exclusion, social protection builds state-citizen relations and social cohesion, social protection supports economic development and productivity, and seemingly now social protection strengthens climate and disaster resilience. And a lot of social protection programs are small and fledgling, and I worry that there's a risk that we're just creating another layer of something that we expect are relatively simple instruments. And so I'm wondering, one of the specific questions came in was about, are there situations where we shouldn't be using social protection for a climate or disaster resilience response? And I'd like to get some reflections from the panel about that. Joe, do you mind if I start with you? I mean, you said too much, too soon, too often.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just a big supporter of getting the basics right. Not to say that complementary programs don't play and can play. The potential is great, but don't despair if that's too hard. Just getting the basic rights is jolly good. And I guess particularly in the context of climate change, reading the fairly recent World Bank report, which talked about 100 million new households, potentially pushed back into extreme poverty if climate change proceeds sort of unmanaged. So in that regard, there may be in the future a bigger caseload for these programs to pick up, and that is already adaptive social protection in some form. So I guess, just doing the regular, predictable, getting that car working and driving around the country each month is good. But it is a really interesting space. It's a really interesting idea, and I think where there are good examples from the region being developed that are replicable, we need to learn from them. I think just sometimes the theory is ahead of the practice.
Thanks, Maria. Are we overburdening social protection with too much in this approach?
In the Philippines, as I mentioned earlier, we have already adopted the Social Protection Operational Framework, and it has 4 components. It's social insurance, labor market intervention, and social safety nets aside from social assistance. So with this framework already, primarily the DSWD will already develop the strategies and programs that will address all of this, no? And will be able to provide all of these services that we are talking about. The other thing is, for cash transfers, the country has recently made into law the 4Ps, or the Pantawid Pamilya Program, which is the primary social protection program of the country. So now it is a law and it has been institutionalized. Therefore, it will not only be short-term, it will not be temporary, but it is more permanent. And it is, of course, a service, or the benefits that they get there will be for education, health, and even livelihood, aside from other assistances that will be incorporated later on, because they are the different agencies now are sitting down to develop its implementing rules and regulations. So there is a greater permanency now for the assistance that we are going to give our poor here in the country.
Yeah, I think this is also a learning that we get out from our work in the ASEAN. So a delegation from countries and colleagues from WFP and UNICEF in the room can complement me. But what we have a cautious kind of like recommendation coming out from our study in ASEAN is that to be very careful when thinking about burdening the very young social protections in the countries with these additional elements of shock responsiveness. And then careful thinking always thinking whether social protection is the first kind of like measure when we think about disaster response. The other thing is that when we look at the country options, the tendency is to look at the more mature programs to think about adding the shock responsiveness elements into it. But even like those more mature programs, like the maternal and child cash transfer in Cambodia and Myanmar, are still very young, where the government is only picking up now with their own budget and implementing it. So while there was a very strong interest, also the recognition that shock responsiveness is going to make the system resilient themselves so that they can continue to deliver the social protection benefit during disasters. But adding other kind of tasks for the system to respond to disaster is going to require a lot more thinking and work, as the limited capacity in the social welfare department of Myanmar, for example, is still very busy looking at expanding the coverage, delivering in the different contexts like Rakhine. So that's a very different consideration have to get into picking up a program to make it shock responsive.
Can I just ask if there's any reflections on that from the floor in relation to, are we overburdening social protection with too much? Or any reflections on opportunities that the climate change and resilience agenda brings us? No? I'm going to throw in an opportunity. One thing is that hand up?
Just really quickly, I mean, I just think that we do need to have some caution. We can get, because it is really exciting, and I think you're completely right. I mean, the reliable car, yes, I'm completely with you. But we just need to be cautious it doesn't take on a life of its own. And if you have a big disaster in a country that has a social protection, new social protection system, but it's only covering 3% of affected households, and people, all right, that people have that maybe as the first go-to point may not be the most appropriate thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if it's back to the idea that we can use social protection, but it's only part of a suite of responses that we have in situations of disasters. But I do think there's an opportunity for me, if I look over the last 10 years at, maybe the last 15 actually, at how the way that people present Ethiopia's Productive Safety Net program has changed. It didn't start off being labelled as being about climate change resilience, but it is now And that's quite smart because it enables you to tap into funding sources that are growing that we would never have had access to before in terms of getting social protection funded. So I think showing how we can be an important part of disaster risk management, but not the only part, it provides lots of opportunities. I have a few specific questions here. I'm just going to open the floor more generally to any other questions that people might have. Okay, we've covered everything, obviously. There were a few questions. Joe, you've already mentioned the Fiji program and the Tonga program. There were a couple of questions asking for more detail, but I wonder whether a more appropriate way of picking that up would be if the people who asked the questions could perhaps go and talk to Joe about it after the session. What I'm going to do now is hand back to the panel and give you 2 or 3 minutes each to reflect on what we've discussed and perhaps tell us what are you going to do next Monday morning? What is it that as a result of this conversation you are feeling enthusiastic about trying to push through, or what problem is it that you're going to go and turn your attention to try and tackle? And are you okay to go first, Maria? Thank you.
Being in the social development department of my office, social protection actually cuts across all sectors. So what problem am I going to attend to when I get back to office? I think everything or nothing. So meaning to say, there is a lot to be done. We are talking about global social protection events so that we will be more adaptive with, and our neighboring countries will also be in tune with what we are trying to do. What I want to emphasize in terms of disaster is preparedness and the involvement of the local government units, because that's where the pain starts, no? And where the disaster really happens. And the responsibility is given to the local governments to attend to all phases, which is preparedness, especially preparedness, and then response, of course, has already been more or less addressed, and recovery. What we are doing now is helping the Bangsamoro region to come up with, there is already a resilience plan or a recovery plan for the Marawi siege, but continually, as part of our mandate in NEDA, we will help the local government units come up with the recovery plans, especially if it's a wide area that we're talking about, like Yolanda, which straddles not only Regions 8, but all the other, even Region 6 for that matter, and the other disasters in the other regions of the country as well. So we have a lot on our plate. Thank you.
Okay, so for me, it's not Monday morning, but it's actually tomorrow morning. Yeah. Because you take the opportunity of the UN agencies attending the week here and then starting the implementation of the roadmap in the Philippines through a workshop. So from a FAO as a UN agency's perspective, to me it's a few key things. One is that the coherence of the technical approaches and the tools and methodologies we are introducing that needs to be consistent and coherent among the UN agencies, and this is why we come together, work together. The second is that is the relevance of the global and regional approaches in the different country contexts. So the way that we set targets and work in the Philippines will be very different compared to Myanmar, compared to Cambodia or Vietnam. And that needs a lot of interactions with the governments as UN as one, understanding the context and act. And the third one is the whole issues of, coordinations and communications. We just don't talk coordination in general among the governments, it's also among us to make sure that we are giving credible support to the member states.
All right, thank you. So I guess for me, in terms of sort of a headline message, I think for some countries in the region, social protection program systems are still nascent. They're still, at the very early stages. And I guess that presents a real opportunity, because I think if you are starting to build your system, you can make a couple of easy choices early on that will help you in the future. And so, retrofitting these sorts of abilities later on, especially in big systems, is by no means easy. So thinking about how you could use your system for disaster response or for climate adaptation is probably time well spent at the early stages. I guess just sort of picking up on Lisa's point about, if you've only got 3% coverage, is it the right tool in the toolkit? I think the other critical question to ask ourselves in disaster response is whether or not our systems can move quickly. Because if it takes a year to get the additional payment out the door, then, if you're not set up to do it, then that's okay. There are other proven humanitarian responses that we can use. So I think they're two really good questions to keep front of mind. In terms of what will I do, I think, in as much as I can coordinate with development partners and government partners, share information, learn from each other, I think that's certainly top of my list.
Okay, last chance. Anybody want to tell us from the floor what they're going to do differently on Monday morning? I might pick people if we don't get any... I'm going to pick on you, Lisa. Tell us what you're going to do differently on Monday morning. You don't want to? Okay, come on, somebody. You've sat and listened to us. What are you going to do differently? We're an all-women panel and we frightened you. Okay, I'm going to try and wrap us up. What I'm going to try and do is pick up on some of these things to do differently on Monday morning and think about some of the principles that might underpin how we work on this moving forwards. And some of them are trade-offs, where there's an opportunity, but we need to be careful. So, first of all, we use the regular car, right? We don't use the one that only comes out once a year or once every 5 years. We use the regular car. But Joe seems to have suggested that we might also want to think about what a new car would look like and how we should use it. I think she might be saying we want to go electric and be more environmentally friendly about our car. That's a possibility. Okay, but we use the car that we know works. The second one is building capacity at a bunch of different levels. So us being realistic about capacities at local government level and recognizing that coordination and conversion isn't just for donor agencies, it's also for us at different levels, so district level or barangay level in various countries. I think the other principle for us is getting focused on things other than disaster response. I think in lots of countries we're doing great and we know where we're heading on using social protection for disaster response, but we're not doing quite so well on recovery, we're not doing quite so well on mitigation. I think we're probably making progress on preparedness. So for me on Monday morning, it's going to be about going back and saying, well, where do I add most value? And I think it's not in the response area. I think it's in the real building resilience area about what we do before to ensure that people aren't impacted as badly by disasters in the first place. The other thing that I think is where there may be a little bit of a trade-off. I, like Joe, I'm a strong believer in getting the basics right. I don't want social protection to get derailed. So we try and make it really great at climate change, disaster response and so on, but it's actually not very good at meeting some of its core objectives. But I also think that we can think carefully about win-win or no regrets situations where there are investments that we can make in our social protection that pay off for us even if we don't face a disaster. And there are various examples of that from Nepal. And then I think finally, the big one for me, it's come up a number of times and I've tried to flag it where it has, is that we see social protection as a complement and one of a set of different instruments that we use for building climate and disaster resilience. So we're not trying to grab the turf with social protection. We're not trying to take over. We're not suggesting that we have all the answers, but we're suggesting that we can use social protection to play a really important role. And that role is especially important for supporting people who tend to get left out of disaster relief. So I'm going to finish with a story from Nepal. There were terrible floods in Nepal in 2017. Some people estimated that they were a 500-year flood event. So that's the kind of thing that we'd expect to see only every 500 years. And I went into a village that was quite badly affected, and accidentally I started a fight. So I started asking questions about who received support and who didn't. And a bunch of people who were in the social protection programs started saying that they'd been left out, that their names were meant to be on the list of beneficiaries and they weren't. And it really struck me that we have to get really clear on how we manage that tension at community level, where people are in social protection programs because they need support, but are dumped out of disaster relief responses because they're in a social protection program, or perhaps because they don't have the capacity to represent themselves to get their name on that disaster relief program. And for me, it was a shocking situation where a year after this flood had happened, it took one small, perhaps naive question to really create a fracture in the community. And so I'd like us to go forward thinking about not just how we build these big systems, but how we do it in a way that respects and responds to some of those tensions at the community level. And with that anecdote, I think I'm going to draw the session to a close. I'd like to thank all of you for your questions, both online and in the room, and I'd especially like us to thank our speakers for a really great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies. Just 3 reminders before we go on break. So there will be group discussions in the afternoon happening from 2 to 4. Please sign up to one of the 6 sessions in your app. Second, please fill out your evaluation forms. We really like to hear from you on how this session, the whole 4-day session, 4-day event happened for you, your experiences. And third, for those who are flying out of Manila, there will be free airport transfer. Please ask the help desk outside in the registration area for more details. And another round of applause for the panel. Please be back at 11 o'clock for the next session. We have our tea break.